And they got a lot of money from Soros, from Steyer, and from Bloomberg. They invested millions. That's why they had over $1 billion campaign money.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 46th Round Table Forum in the Round Table series at New South Wales Parliament House. These forums have been going now for nearly 13 years, if you're not superstitious. We have had 45 of them so far on every conceivable topic of public interest. Okay, and this year, welcome. Thank you for coming so close to the crazy season. The topic as advertised is energy poverty. Energy poverty. That's a very hot potato, energy poverty. Very much on everyone's lips. And our panel of three speakers are Sophie York, Senate candidate for the Australian Conservatives, Craig Kelly, Member of Parliament in the Hurstville-Sutherland area, and Malcolm Roberts, politician and former Senator for One Nation, and they will speak in that order. Now, questions will be invited from members of the audience, that's you, when all three speakers have completed their presentations, and not until then. Keep your questions short and concise, only one question per customer. Do come up to the microphone or your unforgettable words will not be recorded for posterity on our great video which is being made even as we speak. Now, the Roundtable Forums are organised by Western Heritage Australia, which is a long-established discussion and study group, and our aim is to raise consciousness and public awareness on all issues of concern to thinking people, which is you, us, or you, we wouldn't be here. Our motto is we serve truth, not consensus. That's very important. Consensus is not what we serve. We have no connections whatsoever to any political party, religious organisation, cult or business of any kind whatsoever. All monies collected are spent on rental of this venue, publicity and our website, and we're strictly non-profit. And no opinions expressed by our speakers or by members of the audience necessarily reflect Western Heritage Australia. Each person here will speak for themselves alone. Some of our forum topics over 12 years, well, I'll read your list later. I won't read it right now. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker for this evening's panel is Sophie York. She's lead Senate candidate for New South Wales for the Australian Conservatives. She's a Sydney barrister and law lecturer, author, officer in the Royal Australian Navy Legal Reserves, and wife and mother of 4. Welcome, Sophie York, please.
Thank you very much, David Duffy, for inviting me to speak on this panel, and I'm very proud to be here with Craig and Malcolm. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. It's a very important topic. Government has a duty to its citizens to not sabotage our essential services, may not deliver them, but it certainly shouldn't get in the way of them or make them out of reach for us. To have a modern country with high standards of business activity and high living standards, we need reliable energy. It's a no-brainer. And it has to be available at peak times and consistently, not intermittently. It also needs to be at a price level which doesn't cripple business and impoverish families. All people, including the unwell and elderly people and mothers with young babies, and they all need to be able to run their heating in winter and put their fans or air conditioners on in summer and cook if they don't have gas and so forth. The most basic living needs actually need electricity. And we're a first world nation, so these are the markers of a first world nation. Our history of energy is that we have run coal-fired power stations. There's about 24 across Australia and 17 in New South Wales at last count. We now pay about double per kilowatt hour than they pay in the US, and apparently in South Australia they pay up to 3 to 4 times that per kilowatt hour. We have plenty of coal in the ground. There's been a considerable amount of investment put into digging it out and exporting it and using it here in our country, and we are the number 1 coal exporter in the world. Our total coal exports per year are worth 57 billion. So it's a fortune, and that's the reason our nation is rich. That money washes through our entire economy. Japan is our biggest coal customer. They buy 11.2 billion, and they use what's known as HELI systems, which are high efficiency, low emission systems, and that's regarded as the future for energy for them. China's our next coal customer. They buy 5.6 billion, and then it's India, South Korea and Taiwan. Coal is our second biggest export. It's 11% of all our exports, so iron ore is our first and our biggest, coal is next. And Asia is building over 1,000 new coal-fired generators. So they're growing their economies using our coal. Our coal will be burnt and go into the global atmosphere. Our coal. Let's just absorb that fact. So yes, there are renewables and solar, wind, hydro, etc. that will play a part in Australia's future, and why not? We've got a lot of sun and breezes blow, and if we can capture some of it, then great. But it is not reliable because it is dependent on the weather, and battery storage has its limits. In South Australia, by the way, you'll be aware that they had power blackouts last year. They've now trucked in diesel generators to back up their reliability of power. I mean, that's what they use in South Pacific or developing nations for power. It's not the Australian way, and also it adds to emissions. Renewables are not regarded as affordable. The greater the component of renewables in an electricity energy supply, the higher the price will be. Renewables at the moment rely on massive government subsidies that all of us, we all pay for that. There's also health risks. I'm going to throw it in there because the WHO, the World Health Organization, has just said that wind farms pose serious health problems, hearing, mental, and so forth. And that will limit the degree to which they can even be used. Yes, we've signed the Paris Agreement. It was actually signed by Tony Abbott initially and then ratified by Malcolm Turnbull. Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister, signed it on condition that others stayed in. So he gave us an out for it. The Paris Agreement, as you probably know, says that we should drop by 26% our carbon dioxide emissions based on 05 levels. The ALP, if they win office, want to send that up to 45%. I mean, the impact is it would be catastrophic. It's not even imaginable, economically and standard of living and quality of living. If you can't use energy because you can't afford it, that affects your quality of life. Trump, as you know, President Trump dropped out of Paris last year. Paris is actually pointless for Australia. I'm just going to explain why. There's two main reasons. Our contribution to carbon dioxide emissions is actually estimated to be 1.3% of the total global contribution. So even if we shut down every mode of production across the whole country, it wouldn't make one jot of difference. The chief scientist has said this, and they're not my words. It's Alan Finkel who's come to that conclusion. And also China and India have coal-fired stations, and the rate at which they're building them, the rate at which they are building these new coal-fired stations will actually exceed our total emissions soon. So if you just want to absorb that fact. So our coal that we sell is being burnt somewhere across the globe, and they're enjoying that reliable, affordable energy. They're enjoying it elsewhere. So there's no point in us paralysing ourselves with grandiose delusions about how we're going to lower global temperatures. It's a delusion. It's not factual. It's not based on anything that's real. The Australia's Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, has put out a report which you will be aware of, Restoring Electricity Affordability in Australia's Competitive Advantage. I'll save you the trouble of reading it. It basically says our system is broken. Senator Cory Bernardi has said in relation to this report that government subsidising one technology or another is only going to result in higher prices. It's actually propping it up. It's not real. It's not able to stand on its own 2 feet. Now, because I'm in the Conservatives, I'll tell you what our proposal is. So we say that wind and solar is going to continue to cause price hikes. It's not reliable. It's propped up by government subsidies. you'll end up with blackouts, which nobody wants. And it's all, this is probably the most important point, it's all based on highly contested Greens ideology. All of it is based on that. We propose that we keep coal. We've got hundreds of years' worth in the ground. We've already got the systems to dig it up and use it, and all that's in place. The only reason why some of the coal-fired stations are planning to close and whatever is because the government is causing such uncertainty in the market. But, as I said before, the coal is being burnt somewhere on the planet, so, you know, the point of all this closing everything down and virtue signalling is lost the moment you absorb that fact. So even if we stopped using it in Australia, it would still be burnt elsewhere, unless you're proposing that we ban the whole market of it. I mean, we don't have an authoritarian government that would propose banning an industry. Hopefully. We propose that we have a competitive tender for what the government uses as far as power. So the government has its own energy requirements, and it's worth about 450 million. We say let's put that out to tender. That would actually have a big impact in itself, but it would also lead the way, if you like. It would actually make a difference if we said it has to be reliable and affordable power that is supplied under that tender. We also propose considering nuclear power alongside coal. So we in Australia, yes, there is a ban at present on nuclear power in Australia. We apparently are the only OECD country that has this ban. Some countries, yes, they're phasing out nuclear, and you'll remember the 3 Mile Island meltdown in the US in 79 and Chernobyl in 86 and Fukushima in 2011. But they all were old-style reactors, and there were particular conditions that prevailed with respect to each of them. We don't have time tonight to dig down into them, but I'm happy to talk about it after if you'd like to. And stuck valves and human error and shifting tectonic plates and all sorts of things played into those. But the method of delivery now can be different in any event. So they're old-style reactors. We now have something which apparently is called SMRs, small modular reactors, and I'm told that they can be built in a way that is actually quite cost-effective, and they're small, they're the size of a shipping container, and they don't require a water source like the old ones did. They're inherently safe. They can be located locally. There's no problem with the carbon dioxide emissions, if that's an issue for you. It's an issue it's probably not an issue for many of the people in this room, but for Greens it is an issue. They obsess about it. There are more than 400 nuclear plants across the world providing energy, and apparently there's 60 more under construction. But the beauty of it is that we have about a third of the world's uranium in the ground in our country. We're sitting on it, which is wonderful. It's right there in the cupboard, almost. So anyway, and you can get a lot of energy from little amounts of uranium. It's a condensed source of energy. It's brilliant. So it ticks all the boxes: reliable, affordable, no emissions if that's an issue. It's like the trifecta. Now, it will be slightly more expensive, I'm told. The prices are a bit higher than coal, whatever. But anyway, we can chat more about that when we're on the panel. And ANSTO, so the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, ANSTO, says that these SMRs, or they call them Generation 4 reactors, are technically feasible. So it's getting the tick off from people who know a lot more about it than the average person. They actually drill down and study this. So this is all great. Senator Cory Bernardi has put forward a bill, the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Facilitation Bill. So that bill's ready to roar as well. That would lift the ban. And he's also released a white paper recently, and this was done by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT. And what it looked at were the prospects for nuclear energy in Australia. So they burrowed down and did an analysis to see if it could even work in Australia. And it was, I'll give you the names if you're interested, Professor Buongiorno. He's he's a professor of nuclear science and engineering at the MIT, and he did it alongside 2 PhD candidates who also work in the Department of Nuclear Science and Engineering. And they basically used South Australia as a case study to see whether it was feasible. And it proposes a seawater supported, if they need seawater, on the coast, and it would add apparently 600 to 1,500 megawatts of desperately needed baseload power for South Australia. They're stocking on candles over there. I mean, anyway, it would probably cost $4 billion for the first 600 megawatts, and the price for the consumer would be $79 per megawatt compared to 84. Those are 2016 prices. Anyway, so the bottom line is that the South Australian prices would actually be 60% less than the battery-backed, intermittent, unreliable sources that they're proposing, or they are actually using right now. Okay, so that's the very, very good news. Just to give you a bit of current news about what's happening with the coalition, I probably should let Craig talk about this side of it, but just, you've probably read the news. Angus Taylor, one of the best coalition MPs, present company accepted, has written to the Australian Energy Regulator, and he's asking for a default price to be set, and he's also written to the energy companies saying, look, you must lower your prices, and he's also putting in a few government measures about stopping late payment penalties and removing the loyalty tax. If you actually sit with an energy company, you end up paying more. I know, terrible, hey? It's not much of a reward, but anyway. And he's also proposing backing government projects which will show that they reduce the wholesale electrical prices. So, but I've just read that the Australian major energy companies, via the Energy Council, are saying that they are going to sue the government if they do this. So that's the word hot off the press, that they say it's unconstitutional to get involved in this price fixing. So we're at a turning point, and I'm sorry to race you through it all. I'm just conscious that we've got a few panellists here. So we are at a very important stage in our energy issues in Australia. And there's one last point that I want to draw to your attention, because it's one that's been bothering me enormously, and I think it is relevant to all this, and it's to do with what the Chinese Communist government is doing in relation to our essential services. China, of course, has a large population, 1.37 billion, and they are very concerned about food security and energy security. And I mentioned before, they're a massive coal customer of ours. Now, they look long term. They have one of the oldest civilisations on Earth, and they've made a number of strategic acquisitions in Australia. You'll be aware they've got the Port of Darwin, the Port of Newcastle, the Port of Melbourne, you name it. They've got the Confucius Institutes, they've got, you name it, the Cubby Station, the irrigation, the largest dairy farm, the biggest beef station. They've made a few iron ore bids over the years, and they didn't end up getting the Chinalco thing. They went and got Vale instead, and they didn't get GrainCorp, and they didn't get Huawei, the 5G telecommunications bid that they put in. But listen to this. CKI and State Grid, they're Chinese companies, they already control 100% of electricity transmission and distribution assets in Victoria, of course, South Australia, and the ACT. And no prizes for guessing under which governments they got all that, by the way. But anyway, the fact is that many of our essential services are being more and more owned by either the Chinese Communist government or state-owned entities. And last year, they passed legislation, the CCP passed legislation saying that those companies, no matter where they are, have a duty to pass on intelligence to the CCP, so no matter where they are. That means that the Chinese interests trump ours, or surpass ours, or ours become subordinate to it. Our national interests become subordinate to the CCP's. Is everyone comfortable with this? No. No, I didn't think so. So anyway, so that when it comes to the crunch, I think this is very important that we not let essential services fall into the hands of foreign governments, and especially not communist governments. And we can talk about the mechanics, whether we need to strengthen the FIRB, Foreign Investment Review Board powers, or whatever it is, but we must actually put our foot down and say this matters to us, and we've got to stop it. We've got to stop it. If we care about Australia, we've got to stop what we're doing right now and take stock and take charge of our nation. I don't know what these MPs are doing. They've got to take charge and put Australia first. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sophie York. That's given us food for thought. very definitely. Now, the second speaker in tonight's panel on energy poverty is Craig Kelly, federal member for the seat of Hughes, which I think includes the Hurstville Sutherland area. He was elected in 2010, 2013 and 2016, and he's turned a marginal seat, what was a marginal seat in 2010, into a safe Liberal seat, moving Hughes more places along the electoral pendulum than any other current member. Currently facing a pre-selection with date unknown. He's chairman of the Coalition Backbench Committee on Energy, chairman of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Law Enforcement, almost single-handedly destroyed the NEG National Energy Guarantee. Right, your public are here. Before entering Parliament, operation manager in export-import and manufacturing sector, and he also played first grade rugby for St George. Welcome, Craig Kelly, please.
Thanks so much, and thank you for everyone coming tonight. I've got a few little slides and a PowerPoint presentation, so we'll just see if we can get these up without too much drama. Well, I should give my disclaimers. What I say, all my comments are mine alone, and may not necessarily represent those of the Liberal Party.
You mean you might be representing your constituents?
Just while this hopefully will come up with that any great dramas. I gave a speech presentation last month up at Mossman, at a Liberal Party branch of Tony Abbott's electorate, and we actually had an infiltrator, as we often do in the Liberal Party these days. We had an infiltrator actually turn up and tape, secretly record the conversation my speech that I did, and they went home and dutifully copied it all down, wrote it all down, and gave it to the Sydney Morning Herald, who unfortunately didn't publish it but took a few extracts from it. That's okay. And then they gave it to the Guardian. The Guardian was good enough to put it up online. So I think we're recording it tonight. So if anyone here from the Guardian, we've got the infiltrators in, we're more than happy to give you the exact presentation so we make sure we get the quotes exactly correct. Now, here we go. We're having some slight... Right, okay, here we go. Now... Okay, here we start. This is a comment I made the other week, which got many of our friends from the left so upset. And I just thought it was just so self-evident. I said, the climate is always dangerous. We didn't make it dangerous. And it's fossil fuels that protect us from that climate. Because if we are talking about energy poverty, the ultimate poverty that you have in life is an early death. And that's what I was talking about. So let's see how we go. Now, there was a study not recently done by a Professor Indor Golkani. And his study was titled Wealth and Safety, the Amazing Decline in Deaths from Extreme Weather in an Era of Global Warming. Now, we're all told that extreme weather's getting worse and how much more dangerous it is. And I see there's a group called the Australian Youth Climate Group, which try and brainwash and radicalise young kids into their sort of extreme religion. And they always say, we want a climate like our parents, and a stable and safe climate like our parents and our grandparents used to enjoy. Well, Golkani did the numbers. I know it's hard to see here. Today, we are safer from extreme weather than at any time in human history. He looked at the numbers and he went back through, and they did, it's all peer-reviewed, it's all published, not something's made up. They went back and they did all the reports, media reports about deaths from extreme weather. The numbers from 1900 to about 1919 were a bit, before the First World War, were a bit sketchy, so those numbers don't actually reflect it. But from 1920 onwards, from that decade 1920 to 1929, the death rate per million was 241 deaths from extreme weather. That's storms, cyclones, heat waves and the like. The last decade, we got that down to 5. So every single decade since the 1920s, the death rate from extreme weather has declined. And it's declined at those numbers, it's a 98% decline. So kids out there living today in our society, you are 98% less likely to be killed by an extreme weather event than what your grandparents or great-grandparents were 80 to 90 years ago. They are the facts. They're unambiguous. And yet we have today, if you ask any of these kids that go to our school, oh, extreme weather's getting worse, so it's all terrible, we're all going to perish. And it's not only from extreme weather. One of the greatest death rates from energy poverty is if you don't have electricity connected to your home. And that is what happens for billions of people today throughout the world. The way they heat and they cook, they burn animal dung or twigs or straw in their house. That's how you survive if you don't have modern electricity, which we take for granted. Now that indoor, what they call indoor air pollution, actually kills more people than outdoor air pollution. You hear about Schwarzenegger used to go, and I've seen him, oh, isn't it terrible, all this air pollution, it's killing us all, it's all the fault of coal-fired power stations. No, it's the exact opposite. The air pollution that's killing people is when they don't have access to an electricity grid supplied by coal-fired power stations, and they're forced to heat and cook in their own homes with straw, dung and woods. And they're the numbers, peer-reviewed. More than 50% of the deaths occur from indoor air pollution, not outdoor air pollution. So if you want to reduce the deaths from pollution or air pollution, the best way to do that is to give people access to electricity. And we know, as Sophie said, there's hundreds of coal-fired power stations being built all around the world today. About 50 nations around the world. Places like Dubai, where they have no coal. Japan, where they don't have any coal. They've done the sums, and they've worked out the best way and the cheapest way that they can generate electricity and provide it to their people is through a coal-fired power station and paying a premium to import that coal from Australia. The other one of the things that result from energy poverty is it's surprising, this is also another peer-reviewed study, it's moderate cold that is the biggest killer. Now I know they might be a bit difficult to see, the bars there. The first little group of bars there is actually the attributable deaths from extreme, and the first bar is extreme cold. The next bar going up, this is Australia, is moderate cold, then moderate heat, then extreme heat. So it's moderate cold is actually a bigger killer than extreme cold. And that applies all throughout the world. It's the same in Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Italy, or everywhere they did the study, it was moderate cold that was most dangerous. Now, studies have shown that our death rate in Australia from cold weather is double that of Sweden. Because Australian homes are not generally designed to experience and to put up with the cold weather in wintertime. They said the World Health Organization has said that you should have your house heated in winter to at least 18 degrees Celsius. And if it falls below that for a considerable period of time, you are putting yourself at risk of adverse health outcomes. And there are many homes. I know in my electorate, if I went round in the middle of winter, you would find many homes in our nation today in a winter time that do not have the internal temperature at 18 degrees or above, simply because of the cost of energy in this nation, which is an absolute disgrace. It does. Now there's also other studies. It's not only do you need low cost energy to keep your house warm, also studies from the States show that if you have access to air conditioning, that actually reduces the mortality in your country. And in fact, this was a study that was done in December 2012. And they looked at the deaths from extreme heat in the US since the 1960s. And they found, contrary to what whether it's getting hotter or not, that's not the issue. The issue is that deaths from extreme heat in the US since 1960 have declined 75%. And the reason they put that down to is access to air conditioning. And yet again, we have many Australians in this summer that will be unable to afford to heat their homes because of the high cost of electricity in this nation. Unable to cool their homes, this coming summer. This was an article written by the Chicago Tribune. I won't go through it now, but it's a very well-written article, and it basically says, air conditioning is a matter of life or death. Now, this is a little graph. I know that, again, the charts are probably a bit... The chart on the left-hand side, the black one, shows where Australia stood in 1999 with an international comparison of electricity prices. We had the second lowest prices in the world. It was only South Africa that had lower prices than what we had. That's where we were in 1999. Fast forward 2 decades, we have South Australia. This was a study from last year. South Australia, the highest electricity prices in the world. Even higher than Denmark and Germany. New South Wales wasn't far behind, Queensland wasn't far behind, and neither was Victoria. And as Sophie said, if you make comparisons with the US, on average, US electricity prices are around half of what we are paying here in Australia. And if you make the comparison about some US states that are paying under 10 US cents a kilowatt hour, it's a third, almost a quarter of what they are paying today in South Australia. This is a chart that shows the correlation between the more wind and solar capacity in your grid and the high cost of electricity. The correlation is remarkable. It's from Europe. The nations with the most intermittent, unreliable electricity and solar and wind also have the highest prices. The nations with the lowest percentage of solar and wind have the lowest prices. And you can see how that correlation, that line is, how all those nations almost fall along that line. A couple of articles from Forbes, well worth reading. If solar and wind are so cheap, why are they making electricity so expensive? And it has to do with their intermittency. I often hear people say, comparing a coal-fired power station with a solar panel for electricity. You are not comparing like for like. You're not comparing, it's like comparing apples with oranges. You've got to compare fully dispatchable baseload power with fully dispatchable baseload power. If you are comparing the price of intermittent generation with fully dispatchable power, you're not comparing apples for apples. And it's all those additional costs that come in with the solar and wind that are the reasons why you see this high correlation between things. Again, now, we saw South Australia had the highest electricity prices in the nation. They also have the highest electricity bills. This was a chart. This is from the Australian Energy Regulator. You can see the red scrawling around the middle. That's 2015, 16 and 17. With the average electricity bill in South Australia for residential is well over $2,000. In New South Wales, it's around about the 1,600 mark. So again, significantly higher prices paid by South Australians because of their delusional policies of pursuing 50% renewable energy targets. And what's that done to disconnections? Of course, South Australia, it looks like night follows day, they have the highest amount of households as a percentage of their population that's had their electricity disconnected. How does someone survive in today's society if you have your electricity disconnected? How do you charge your mobile phone? How do you have a hot shower? Or run a TV, or run a fridge, or cook your meals? Yet we have in South Australia the hardship that causes to people, to have your electricity disconnected because you cannot pay it. And the direct result of those policies of that South Australian government have pushed more people into the greatest poverty that you could, and that is to deny them access to electricity. Now, this is, of course, we've done this because it's all about reducing our CO2 emissions. And we talk about renewable energy targets, but they're not actually renewable energy targets, they're renewable electricity targets. Our electricity sector makes up less than 1/3 of our total greenhouse gas emissions, which under the Paris Agreement. So agriculture and transport make up a greater percentage as they do of electricity. So agriculture is not about a farmer putting solar panels on his roof or making his tractor run on electric tractor. It's basically animals burping and farting. I know we laugh, but that is how those emissions, that's where the emissions come from. Now, the only way that you can reduce those emissions in your agricultural sector, there's some experimental work about feeding animals, supplementing their diet with seaweed. Right? So now that's how you supplement. We've got something like 20 million sheep or 30 million sheep. How you supplement their diet with seaweed and hand feed them is beyond me. Right? So the reality is, if you are going to reduce the emissions in your agriculture sector, you have to cull your herds. We talk about go out to the farming areas and say, oh, you've got to take action on climate change. Well, that means you've got to cull your herds. And if you want a 26% reduction, or Labor's 45% reduction, that means you've got to cull your herds 45%. We're talking about millions of our cattle, our beef cattle, our dairy cattle, and our sheep that need to be culled. The other sector is transport. And again, transport sector is made up, the 18%, it's not just road transport of cars. It's trucks. Yes, and okay, there's some idea of electric cars, but I'll leave that for another night. But there's no plan whatsoever to be able to run electric trucks throughout the nation. It's also commercial aviation is a big percentage of that transport. Yes, you can do a few things. The new planes that are coming out are slightly more fuel efficient, but you can't run electric planes. The batteries, the weight of the batteries makes it impossible for the things to take off. Then you've got what's called direct combustion. That's gas that's used for home heating. It's gas that's used in industry, in our plastics industry. It's where mining sectors have their own electricity generation. That's another 19%. Mining fugitives, that's when you basically dig up a coal seam or you drill for gas, that you get fugitive emissions of methane that come out naturally. Then you've got industrial processes, cement manufacturing. Cement manufacturing, the calcium that you use in it, it's not the energy that you use, it's the natural processes of the cement manufacturing. It's the same with aluminium manufacturing. There's nothing you can do, unless you've got some form of carbon capture and storage, there's nothing you can do other than to move those industries offshore. So when we hear about this, about everyone taking action on climate change, and let's talk about they put the solar panels and wind turbines up, we are talking about 1/3 of our emissions. Now, that's 1/3. Now, a chief scientist, these are his words from a Senate inquiry. It was Senator McDonald. He said, in Australia, we emit less than 1.3 of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. Chief scientist said, that's about right. The senator asked, if we were to reduce the world's carbon emissions by 1.3, which means we basically depopulate the nation and all go and commit hurry-curry or jump into the sea and kill all our cows and close down all our mines and our factories, he said, what impact would that have on changing the climate of the world? Chief scientist. Virtually nothing. The chief scientist of Australia. And I go down to Parliament, and all of these Parliament, they stand up and go, we need to take real action on climate change. If you say, you are denying the science. There is nothing that we can do in Australia, irrespective if the models are 100% right, there is nothing that we can do in Australia that will change the temperature or stop bad weather or stop the 7 seas from rising. That is what the chief scientist and the scientist and everyone knows. But yet we have this facade of belief that we can somehow have policies to change the weather. Just a couple of quick more slides, I'm running a little bit over time. we hear about this transition to a renewables future. This graph shows that it's not a transition. Where renewables are coming in, it's addition, not transition. This goes back, the graph starts at 1900, goes through to 2017. The bottom is coal, the red line is coal. The orange is oil. The yellow colour is gas. So you can see how it's been this great increase. Then the green is nuclear. The blue is hydroelectric. And when we get to that little band up the top, if you can get your microscopes out, that's combined wind, geothermal and solar. So the idea that you are going to get your wind and your solar to replace your fossil fuels is just a complete and utter nonsense. In the US, this is another graph I like. This shows US energy consumption by fuel source. This is put out by their American, it's the American Energy Information Administration. Now, we go back to 1950, 90% of US's energy came from fossil fuels. We go through to today, this is 2017, 80% of their energy was from fossil fuels, 11.4% from renewables, which includes hydro, which is important, which is mainly hydro, and 8.6% was nuclear. They projected this out to 2050, middle of the century, and they say fossil fuels will dip to 79%. So have a 1% reduction in the percentage of the US's energy coming from fossil fuels by the middle of the century. And yet we are consistently bombarded with the message, oh, there's this energy transition going on, that all these fossil fuels are being phased out. Complete and utter nonsense. So when this is last year's International Energy Agency 2017. The 2018 report is only just out this week. I haven't had a chance to go through it. But it showed that in 2016, solar and wind combined made up a grand total of 0.8% of the world's energy. So we spent trillions of dollars subsidising these technologies for decades, and they haven't even cracked it for 1% of the world's energy supply. And projecting out to the year 2040, assuming what they call the new policies, assuming we bring all these targets in for Paris and we continue to subsidise and spend billions of dollars, we'll get to 3.6% of the world's energy coming from solar and wind. Also, investment in renewables around the world is declining. The International Energy Report warns of a decline in investment. I can go through and show more of this. So that's pretty much where we are. Now, we've had today Woodside, one of our biggest companies, come out and say we should have a carbon tax. Now, the reason why Woodside would say that, I always say, follow the money. Follow the money, right? Woodside produce gas, right? If you have a carbon tax on electricity generation, it gives gas a commercial advantage over coal because gas has lower CO2 emissions per megawatt hour of electricity produced than coal does. So Woodside are saying this in their own vested interest. But what they are doing, they are saying to the 99.9% of other companies in this nation, we want you to pay even more for electricity. To those small businesses out there, we want to actually hit every impost and every input into your business with a carbon tax. That's what they are saying. The IPC report that was released last week talked about a carbon tax by 2030. They talked about up to $5,500 US a tonne. That was what they talked about by 2030. And they talked about going to $27,000 by... But let's just take that amount, what they said, of $5,500 US per tonne, right? That's about 7,600 Australian dollars per tonne, which is about, let's round it down, $7 per kilo a tonne. Now, remember when Barnaby Joyce talked about the 100